So thank you, everyone, for coming, and to Prue and Howard for sponsoring this event. And it's just an opportunity to say thanks to the BridLit team as well. Tom, Adrian, Joanna, and Annette, you are absolute superstars, what you pull together. Thank you. They're behind the scenes every single day for weeks to pull this, so thank you. I live here in the Marshall Vale, but I have a habit of not spending the time here that I should. My work is with the far away, and each book takes me about 5 years to pull off. And that's with a hell of a lot of help, not least from my beloved family. My parents, Anne and Johnny Roberts, are in the audience this evening today, and my very ever-patient husband, John Fisher. So for the next 50 minutes or so, well, 45 minutes, I'm going to be taking you on a journey which kind of winds past and present, which is the way that I write my books. They're quite complex, braided narratives, and this is not an easy story. And as a reader pointed out to me in a letter I got just earlier this week, it's one they least expected to be written by a woman. And I thought, well, hell to that, because there's this one message I hope this book delivers, which is the same message I give our two sons and any young writers I work with. It's that the world is full of all sorts of ungoogleable stories that are worth telling. And if you're obsessed enough, the endeavor, not the agenda or anything else, comes first. So, first, I'm just going to give you a little short film, which is a compressed way of explaining the kind of the historical narrative and how it winds with the present. So, here you go.
In 1879, King Leopold II of Belgium launched an ambitious plan to plunder Africa's resources. He needed a transport system. The key to cracking open the continent, or so he thought, was its elephants. If only he could train them. Leopold commissioned a charismatic Irish adventurer, a man of empire, working in the Persian Gulf, to ship 4 tamed Asian elephants from India to the East African coast, where they were marched inland from Dar es Salaam towards Congo. His aim was to reach Lake Tanganyika near the middle of the continent and start an elephant capture operation using the Asian elephants and their mahouts to show how it could be done. When I came across this lost story in the archives, it piqued my interest on numerous levels. As I pieced together all the different characters, I started to think Leopold's expedition could open a window into how 19th century European imperialism remains tightly bound with topics of enduring consequence: racism, resource extraction, wildlife extinction. In retracing the journey of Leopold's elephants, I could see a way to explore the connections between past and present. I travelled to Iraq, India, Tanzania, and the DRC. My journey set against extraordinarily beautiful, but also very damaged landscapes. I bring to life a cast of 19th century characters, but also a myriad of modern voices. Why does it matter to me? Because of the people I meet, the memories I uncover, the stories I find in the margins. A training school for elephants is neither straight history nor straight reportage. It's a story which weaves together both. It looks at our broken relationship with animals. It's a reckoning with colonialism. Most of all, it recognises that no one is a nobody just because they've fallen silent in the historical record.
So I'm going to take you back to where this story started, which was in a place called Garamba National Park, which is up in the Northeast Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was in 2015, and I was there on a newspaper assignment reporting on an elephant habitat in absolute crisis. There were various armed militia groups operating in the area, coming in from Uganda and what is now known as South Sudan, including Joseph Kony's LRA child soldiers. It was so dangerous that the people in those communities couldn't move more than 5 kilometers from their homes without the risk of kidnapping or murder. It was incredibly difficult to get in. We had to rely upon a missionary organization, the Missionary Airline Fellowship. I've used them in a number of places I've worked, in Chad, in Papua New Guinea, and these are some of the best bush pilots in the world, because for the word of God, they'll go anywhere. And I remember in Chad a particularly unnerving moment where, as we were taking off, the pilot actually held the Bible and asked us to all say a prayer. But that was the only way in, and it was a fascinating journey that triggered something. This was 10 years ago, and it sat with me for a while, but I just need to explain the geography. You see the black dot in the middle of that map above Lake Albert. That is where Garamba is in northeast DRC. The other things which will help make sense of the talk ahead is Lake Tanganyika. Those are Africa's Great Lakes coming through the middle of the continent. Lake Tanganyika is the longest lake in the world and the second deepest after Lake Baikal in Siberia. Tanzania, here on the eastern side, and the island in Zanzibar, now incorporated into Tanzania, is where the main part of this journey takes place. Also note, please, the Democratic Republic of the Congo on that western boundary. And that territory of Central and Eastern Africa is where this book is essentially set. Now, when I was there, I was focusing on the ivory trade, and it's important I set this up because it's a really important theme in the book and how it links past and present. When I visited Garamba, the ivory poaching it had already run rampant. You would never get tusks this size anymore. They just don't exist. But the year I was born, in 1973, the elephants were running in herds, as one eyewitness report, of sort of 1,000 elephants strong in a single herd. That particular account described the elephants like a solid grey army on the march. But in 2015, when I was visiting, they were killing them from helicopters. This was the only herd I saw, and you can see they show the habit of the hunted, the way their elephants, their tails are up like an antenna at the back. They're deeply traumatized animals. This context it's got a little bit better in the last 10 years because there's some critical conservation work that's been achieved, but against all odds. In South Sudan, which just borders this area, I was working there in January, and we managed to track the last elephant because it wears a GPS collar. And moving in an area that's 6 times the size of the Masai Mara, huge area, last elephant left. And it is so lonely, it moves with a herd of giraffe. Now, that to me was worth some kind of inquiry about what had happened, because at the beginning of this 19th century, which is the historical narrative in this book, there were 26 million African elephants on that continent. Now, between 400 and 500,000. And I think sometimes perspective needs to be had in these situations, and that's what I was trying to look at by following this story. Now, before the international trade on ivory came in, which was in 1990, elephants, just to be clear, were being slaughtered for their ivory, for a luxury goods market that was outside of the African continent. This is one of the pictures in the book. It's an American billiard ball dealer at the beginning of the century. They were obviously used for pianos, a massive link with my first book. Used for Victorian dildos, sweet everything they were used. And in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, just a single port, Belgian port of Antwerp alone, 90,000 African elephants, tusks were shipped through. Just an absolutely staggering scale. It's important to understand all the people that were complicit with that, because they were African, Arab, Swahili, Indian, European, and American. It was a big business in the 19th century. It's also important to understand the shifts in desire, because there was this reputation that everybody wanted the whitest ivory possible and the best to carve, which meant there was a late 19th century spike in demand for the tusks of female forest elephants. Those female forest elephants existed on the west side of Lake Tanganyika in the Congo Basin. So that west side of Lake Tanganyika, where you see the elephant in the bottom of the map there, was what they call the ivory frontier. Congo was the prize. Now, That value of the raw material was, of course, not particularly obvious to the Africans living in those zones. They were swapping ivory for the price of a tin can. The extraction of that ivory was also very closely wound with the Arab Swahili slave trade, which you can see from the arrows moving across this map. Everybody knows the story about the Atlantic slave trade that came out of West Africa to America to populate the plantations on the American continent. But this Eastern trade was coming out up to populate Arabia. Now, and India actually as well. So look at those arrows. And in order to get the ivory out, they needed slaves. So they were very closely wound. And this East African slave trade, there's a brilliant book that I'm very sad didn't win the Bailey Gifford Prize for nonfiction by somebody called Justin Morozzi, which I urge you to buy, called Captives and Companions. But that's the first really significant book published earlier this year about this Arab slave trade. I mean, something like 2.1 million in 500 years were taken out of those ports, of which Zanzibar was the last to close, as late as 1873. And you'll see in the course of this talk how close that history really sits to the present. Anyway, on that trip in Garamba 10 years ago, I had this very strange encounter in one of these small communities we'd flown into, where there was these abandoned buildings, and behind these abandoned buildings was this abandoned boulevard, like something out of a Brussels, kind of 19th century Brussels, except it was completely overgrown with these huge stones, of which there still had some chains linked to these stones, and those were the chains that were used to tether elephants under Leopold's scheme to create a training school for elephants. And it was haunting, it was strange, it was odd. But underneath that layer of that training school was a much earlier attempt he'd made in 1879 to bring 4 Indian elephants to the Congo and to use those Indian elephants to capture, to help, they use them like decoy elephants to capture wild elephants, but also the 13 Indian mahouts, or elephant trainers, for them to teach the Africans how to do it, because Africa had no tradition in trained elephants, apart from Hannibal many eons before. But it had no active tradition in using elephants as working animals, whereas in India, they did. So that was the idea. But this forgotten expedition of 1879 with these 4 elephants was completely missing from any story, any archive. It was 13 lines in a very important, brilliant book by somebody called Adam Hochschild, which is the seminal book on Leopold's Congo and colonialism. 13 lines, and that was it. And I thought, that's odd. And I have this kind of basic principle with my work, which is, make use of puzzlement. If it's puzzling, there might be something in there that is worthy of the inquiry. So off I went, and this is what my husband calls my serial killer walls. I do them for each book, where I start to sort of piece together. I do them also for articles, where I piece together the different players, the different moments, and I see, my brain thinks kind of visually, and it started to make much more sense to me. But this 1879, when this expedition took place, it was an absolute pivot moment in the way the world worked together or otherwise. The Suez Canal opened that year, just before. So what you have is suddenly the route from Europe to India is much shorter. You don't have to go around the bottom of Africa. You also have the first telegraph being laid between Europe and Africa. That happened in 1879. You also have, and this is the story that everyone knows, is the really popular story of the great hero that is Henry Morton Stanley. 1879, he's off on his first trip to the Congo on behalf of Leopold of Belgium on a very quiet, sneaky little run. And he's coming up where that white line is going around the map. He's coming out of Zanzibar where he's filled up his ships for Leopold, goes around the top of Africa and then comes in up the Congo River on the other side. That was a very secret expedition. But it passed, ship by ship, these 4 elephants coming in from India on the other side. Yet these elephants have been completely forgotten in history. So I started to dig into it because I felt that there was this kind of nexus of things that were going on that were worthy of inquiry. And that with a wonderful woman who's sadly not in the audience tonight, a local woman who I met on a train 7 years ago, Serena Strang, who stood by me through this difficult book, a brilliant historian in her own right. But together we dug into some 500, well, there was 50 archives, 88 different countries. We transcribed 500,000 words from letters, diaries, all of them lying deep in the sort of historical record in places as far away as Florida, Zanzibar, Belgium. And we started to piece together a story that felt very alive because of the amount of memory that had been written in beautiful, beautiful detail, right down to a single tree that they may have camped under. So I had the exact coordinates of the expedition and all the main players. So, why do it? I'm interested in big history and how to get people to care. My children did not learn about Leopold's genocide in Congo. 10 million Africans, he's responsible for their deaths. They didn't learn about that at school. I thought, how can I get that general reader into that space? And an elephant is a good trick. It's a softer way in than saying Leopold was responsible for the death of 10 million Africans. A bit like with pianos, a piano is a softer way in to look at the fact that Stalin put 3 million people into a gulag where they perished. So that's the kind of strategy I'm using from a literary sense. Just if anyone that was listening to Lise Doucette, she uses he was on stage just before me, she uses the lens of a hotel in Kabul to tell the last 50 years of history in Afghanistan. So it's a similar kind of narrative technique. But why was I doing it? I was doing it because I was also really uncomfortable with my own role and profession, which is I've covered Africa as a journalist for Financial Times, I've worked for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, and it's always been through, or largely through the lens of, yes, conservation, but also safari. And while magnificent, absolutely magnificent, I was conscious of how much more to Africa lay outside the gates of those protected areas. That kind of outsider, that sort of outsider romanticism, the kind of out of Africa trope, there's so much more. And I needed to get off that tourist path to kind of get into the oral history of a place. And there's a wonderful writer who I go back to again and again, called Kapuscinski. He was a Polish journalist and travel writer. And he wrote a book called Travels with Herodotus, which I hold very dear. And he says this, in the world of Herodotus, the only real repository of memory is the individual. In order to find out that which has been remembered, one must reach this person. If he lives far away, one has to go to him, to set out on a journey. And after finally encountering him, one must sit down and listen to what he has to say. To listen, remember, perhaps write it down. That is how reportage begins. Of such circumstances, it is born. So, this is the moment my husband always loathes, where I say, I'm going to do it. And so I set myself up in a big block of time. It was still during COVID, and Tanzania was the only country which didn't lock down. The leader at the time, Magufuli, said, if you just have a sauna, it'll be all right. And he was, if you may remember, died in mysterious circumstances, possibly from a virus called COVID. But anyway, I was very fortunate. I spent a long time looking for the right interpreter, which is an absolute key part of the work I do. They've got to be able to get the energy. They've got to understand the motivation. It's hard work because you have 3 months on the road. And I was very fortunate to work with Ramtula Nasari, who stands in the center of Tu Sukuma that we met when we were on the road. A brilliant, brilliant man with the patience and the resilience of I don't quite know what. And then this fella here, a guy called Wolfie Purcell, the son of a friend of mine he was raised on Lake Tanganyika. And I wanted him to help as well, not only as a Swahili speaker, but because he had, he's half my age, and the perspective of a kind of youth perspective of Tanzania was really important to me. My kit list was pretty straightforward. We had one vehicle carried everything. This is how we slept on the road, because I was following it right down to tree by tree in order to see how that landscape had changed between these two moments in time. So this is the tents, little pop-up tents we'd all have. And there you go, some product placement. One of the great Dorset companies, Firepot Food, which is my husband's dehydrated food. But it was very, very different from what those explorers took with them. And if I may, I'm just going to read a short bit of the book. This is the 19th century packing list that my fellows used in 1879. A free and easy suit of tweeds and pith hat, recommended the Royal Geographical Society's man. French sunglasses were essential, and a floppy, broad-brimmed, wide-awake hat, recommended another of the explorers. Most British travellers, however, relied on advice from Francis Galton, the English eugenicist and Nile explorer, whose Art of Travel was a popular how-to guide for geographers, missionaries, and others who, I quote, have to rough it. His tips range from the required roominess for a tent, including expedition furnishings with the most show for their weight, such as rugs and dinner services. He advised on the value of fireworks to impress locals, heavy bullets needed to bring down an elephant, opera glasses for hunting, how to lift a sarcophagus from an Egyptian tomb, and last but not least, how to smuggle jewels by stitching them under your skin. Professional navigational tools included a prismatic compass, sextant, artificial horizon, sounding line, and pedometer. Decent medical supplies needed to come from home, though one British missionary gave very specific advice on a good Stone Town opium dealer, just in case visitors were caught short. A simple, commonplace cookery book wouldn't go amiss either, and one or two of the new best-selling travelogues. So there you go, that's the exact tent diagram of the ones the 1879 expedition used, and an experiment for a mosquito net. So, they recommend taking a cookery book. I took Orwell, Shooting an Elephant, an absolutely brilliant essay on an indictment on colonialism, and I recommend it to anyone. It's one of the great short stories of all time. Abdelrazak Gurna, who is a Swahili-born British author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature a couple of years ago, he has written a brilliant book called Paradise, which covers this same territory, not historical events, but the same physical territory that I do with this book. But ultimately, I definitely learn more from people and not from libraries. That's why I get on the road and I go down to that kind of ground level. And this guy you see on the left in the green T-shirt, he was a fellow called Hazina. He was an amazing man whose grandmother was a slave. In the 1970s, he'd got work with a British archaeologist on the Tanzanian coast. And he said to me, his name, Hazina, he means treasure. I said, oh, that's a nice name. He goes, yeah, I'm like a bank of knowledge. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. He was a historian. And then he said to me, and this stayed with me, he said, you white people, you don't see me. The British educated me, but you don't see me. You don't see the knowledge in my name. And it was good to start out with that very stark reminder of how you have to listen differently when you're listening to oral history on the road. The other gentleman on the right is the fellow called Malilo, very, very funny man who I worked with on Lake Tanganyika, a Congolese fisherman in his younger life. And he took me to the memorial where Livingstone famously met Stanley, you know, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And we were standing there, and he said, apropos of nothing, he goes, explorers, I just don't like them. They come to see what we have, our raw materials, and then, like the rest of them, their people come and take them away. And it's those perspectives that I was looking for to completely kind of rewrite the way that I was handed down history, which is Henry Morton Stanley, David Livingstone, you know, the great heroes of the explorer, the age of exploration. Maybe there's another narrative out there. So I spent time in Iraq and India because my main character, the reason he was hired was because he was an Arabic speaker. He'd worked on the River Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq, and also India because I had work to do with the mahouts who were in the story and the elephants. But the main thrust of the journey was across Tanzania, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Right, so I start in Stone Town, the capital of Zanzibar. I go over the water. to Dar es Salaam, through to the Uluguru Mountains, and then up through the Pugu Hills. Zanzibar was a really important moment for me to access an important 19th century records, and it's a city I absolutely loved, and I'm going to read a little short bit from that. This is in the book. The island's story oozed from every pore, from the strips of orange peel drying in pools of cobbled light, from the oily heads of cloves and fattened peppercorns sweating in the heat, from the buttery chapatis, the briny mangroves, and the silver fish drying on the shore. It was a story of migration, of different people and their cultures arriving on Arab dhows, traveling with the trade winds. But if I could smell Zanzibar's story the moment I arrived, I could also hear it in the sounds bubbling up through the narrow back streets of Stone Town, in the puttering rise and fall of voices drifting down its passageways. Swahili, a sing-song mix of Arabic and African Bantu languages, stems from the Arabic word sawahil, meaning coast. Those maritime origins surface in the fluid syntax, in the jaunty upwellings of Y's and Z's, in the suffixed A's and I's as light as the surf, in the liquid vowels spilling out of the windy mausim, root of monsoon. Even the word safari has the breeze blowing through its origins. It comes from the Arabic safara, which means to journey. The view from the rooftop of where I was staying overlooked the heads of coconut palms, washing lines, and a warren of stairways. The waterfront lay beyond. Each morning, I'd wake up listening to other early risers moving through the entangled streets to the unlocking of the bakery opposite and the patter and coo of pigeons. It was my favorite part of the day, when the sunshine wasn't yet too piercing and the powdered walls of Stone Town were soaked in a pale pink light. School children hurried along in clacking flip-flops, the girls gliding through the chalky streets in flowing white hijabs. There was a musician I saw more than once, carrying a pear-shaped oud or lute strapped like a turtle shell to his back. He seemed to me a symbol of everything gracious about this town, with its crooked alleys too narrow to pass through without giving to a stranger walking the other way. The neighborhoods felt connected. The community's mixed heritage evident in the way the churches and needle minarets stood side by side, and in the long stone benches where Zanzibaris would gather later in the day. I got talking with a singer who explained the cultural osmosis evident in the sounds of the island's traditional tarab music with its Arabic scales, and how, in the 19th century, the dhows brought change from Yemen, Somalia, and India. The image of the boats made me think how these days any gentler experience of time and space is compressed into the twisted arc we watch grow over the screen in the flight map on the back of the airline scene in front of us. With the speed of getting from one place to another, we no longer absorb each other's nuances at the pace of a weather pattern. We come and go too fast. So Zanzibar was pretty special, but the surface romance was surface. This gentleman here, Abdul Sharif, a brilliant Tanzanian historian who helped me go through all the kind of the deep narrative of the slave trade there. And this is our Anglican cathedral that was constructed in 1879 on the place of the very last slave market there. It was the Omani Arabs. This was their capital for a number of years in Stone Town in Zanzibar. And anyway, it was in Zanzibar that I found one of my most important sources. I was poking around the church diaries, the mission diaries that were kept in 1879, and I saw this tiny little handwritten note in one of these diaries in the archives, which was the Anglican bishop there was, he was agitated by the arrival of these 4 elephants into port because it was taking attention away from the ordination of the first ever black deacon being made in this church. And he was like, they're all looking at the elephants and not looking at this major piece of history that's happening. And I thought that was kind of, maybe I could get a paragraph out of that if I visited the church. So I went down to the graveyard, and there was this very old gentleman washing his clothes and drying them on the gravestones. And he introduced himself as the caretaker and church sexton. He said his name was Peter Sudi, and we got talking. And he was the most extraordinary man. He told me that the deacon that was being ordained that day was his great uncle, that he remembered sitting on his knee as a child. He could describe his gait, his face, his laugh, his voice. And then he told me that that deacon, his great uncle, had also been a slave, and he'd been taken from an area just south of Lake Tanganyika. And it was incredible. It was like the past just came roaring into the room. 1879 was suddenly so present. And that was the thing that gave me confidence that this history, it sits much closer than we think. Here he is, Peter Sudi, very, very special man. Then we went on to Dar es Salaam, which is currently the second fastest growing city in Africa, which is pretty remarkable. But that's because it's an African port out of which we are ripping so many of those continents' resources. To navigate the journey ahead, I needed a lot of help. Tanzania is a very difficult country. You may have seen the elections this week, a 99% victory, whatever. But it's complicated because Tanzania is made up of 120 different tribal groups, different ethnicities. And in order to hold that together, after the abuses of colonialism, Julius Nyerere, the first leader of a post-colonial Tanzania, he went for the socialist state. Instead of talking about yourself as a member of a tribal group, he went with Tanzanian first. He created this concept called Juma, which is familyhood. But that also created a huge culture of suspicion towards outsiders, including journalists. It's a really difficult and dangerous place for journalists to work, which I thought I'd got rid of that, having been arrested and thrown out of Russia. I thought I was on safe territory. Oh no, it's a damn tricky place to work. But I just was blessed, as you are when you trust people sometimes, with people that help me. Onwards, this is the beach, Msasani, where the elephants were disembarked, and I'm starting to follow it really very closely. This is the process of their disembarkation. It was this is images made by a Belgian observer from 1879 using this pulley system. The story has a lot of the elephant in it. The elephants kind of carry the narrative drive. This is the exact route the elephants took. It's the exact road that was made in 1879. They managed to build something like 2 miles of track, and then the rest was just sheer bush. But this is now Chinese made. And the path to empire was very clear in 1879. The path out for all those goods coming out of Central Africa is also very clear now. The Chinese are on it. I went up into the Pugu forest where the elephants came up through, and this fella here, a guy called Nasaro Jazwa, he was familiar with the elephant story. It had come to him by oral tradition, and he was a magnificent man, and we stayed in the forest with him for a number of days, and he said to me, everything that we touched, smelt, felt, he knew its medicinal power or whatever it might be. And he said to me, he believed all the knowledge we'd ever need to save our species was right here, girdling the city, Dar es Salaam. He also feared would soon swallow the forest up. These are really fragile landscapes. So over from Bugu Hills, I start moving through those mountains, the Uluguru. As you can see, I'm completely off the tourist map now. The Uluguru Mountains were amazing, extremely high levels of endemism. It's one of the last surviving relics of a broken chain of ancient forests reaching all through these kind of Eastern Arc mountains. And they found an antelope there as recently as 2003 that they'd never come across before. The ethnic group there are called the Luguru, run by women, which obviously I liked. This is in Kalosa. The train, a German train from 1914 is still operating on this same line, and I found that completely fascinating. It's a piece of history that's about to disappear forever. But I had to hop on the train in order to follow one bit of the journey more closely because the car couldn't take the same route. A beautiful, beautiful ride, but it was not as simple as nostalgia. Like so many colonial stories around railways, we can't say we gave them the railways, I'm telling you, because this railway has an incredibly violent history of oppression that I needed also to unpick. Still used by traders. You can see the Swahili Arab connections here, just in the faces. It's still, there's a lot of trains still running between the coast and the DRC, Burundi, Malawi, Zambia. This is really, really important route. That's it, whistling through the Rubeho Mountains. You can ride that train for like $10, 2 days, first class. That's the capital, Dodoma. The capital, no one thinks, they all think Dar is the capital, but it's Dodoma right in the middle of the country. Perhaps it's time for this train to be retired. This was one of the derailments that I was, delayed me for a day or two. But then I cross over into Ugogo. This is very difficult country. It's drought country, out towards the Atigi thicket. The caravans at that time, the slave caravans with ivory, they were sometimes 3,000 people strong. Can you imagine 3,000 people moving through with slaves and ivory? And there was one missionary who was there the same year as the elephants who said this large plain, the Ugogo Plain, was not unlike a dirty bare common in England. It's horrible with the filth and refuse and ashes of so many caravans. It all was just coming to light in the reading I was doing from that period. This is the Atigi thicket. This is one of the most dreaded parts of the journey these elephants made, because this thicket is this kind of like crazy thorn where the thorns are like a finger long. They're harpoon thorns that you have to cut your way through. And remember that the Africans were all walking barefoot, the elephants obviously, and that thorn was just absolutely horrific. It's called the Atigi thicket. You still get tiny remnants like bushes. But this woman here, a woman called Eda Mapwebwe, she was somebody who gave me incredible insight into how that landscape had changed. There was just so much oral history. You had to spend days and days just like sitting down and talking and hearing it. And that's a tiny bit of it that was written down, but otherwise it was all in her head. That area, the Atigi, was the gateway to Western Tanzania, to this area called Ugala, where I was, again, incredibly lucky, because Ugala, right up until about, 2 months of my journey, that was completely ring-fenced for big game hunters. So I couldn't get in. They would definitely not let journalists kind of squirrel their way through. But I was really fortunate. They just changed the law, and I was able to traverse that area. Tabora, this was where they all stayed. It was where David Livingstone stayed, Richard Francis Burton stayed, but Stanley stayed, and it is now a museum, and it's where my guy Carter stayed in 1879. But this is the only records they have in country. All the history, apart from in Zanzibar, which has some, is not in Africa. It's in Belgium, it's in England, it's in Birmingham, it's in Edinburgh. And there was so little in this museum remembering that history. It was like this, kind of like slightly pathetic map. And it was in front of that museum that was this huge mango tree that matched up with a description of the same topography as my 1879 diaries. And I was standing by that mango tree, and I said to my interpreter, Remtula, I said, if that tree could speak, I said, what would you ask it? And he said to me, I'd ask it to tell the truth. How were the Africans treated? The road from Tabora, again, it's like there's so much, the past was so close to the present. One of the main trading goods, aside from ivory, was salt. They're still mining it just as they have done for 1,000 years in a place called Avenza, mining it by spade. Palm oil, same thing, harvested locally. I'm just going to watch the clock. We then go through Ugala. This is the old hunting area where, and I should point this out, I've been 2.5 months on the road by now. I've still not seen a single wild elephant, not a single one, nor here. They've all gone, unless you're in the national parks, which are closer sometimes to zoos than they are to the wild. But we don't know that because we just, we see one version through one kind of camera, but it is really real. That wildlife is fenced in effectively. But what is even more interesting, in my view, is that in 1879, that my caravan, the 4 elephants with Frederick Carter at its head, had also not seen a single wild elephant. They'd already massacred the elephants all the way to the coast of Lake Tanganyika. So there were no elephants for them to train. This plain, beautiful, beautiful place, which is a very important part of the kind of final denouement of the book. That I could just get right down to the places and the people, including this spring, which is where a major scene occurs in the book. which is sacred to the Mpimbe people, who he's the chief with his 2 sisters. And again, just a huge, huge resource of oral history. And he said to me, he said, no one stopped to ask. No one's ever stopped to ask. We don't go into that kind of oral narrative that you find on the ground. And it really matters, because those oral narratives are also their form of land ownership. It's not all written down. So when these mass evictions occur out of protected areas, all they've got is their oral memory. And that is not codified into law. It means they're unprotected. So what you can see here is that by exploring this story, I was able to look at some really modern conservation politics that are going on alongside. Right, I'm going to give 5 more minutes and then over to questions. Lake Tanganyika, this is where the Belgians start to build their training school right there in the south. It is an absolutely remote and remarkable spot. There are no boats that run down that lake. There's no road linking Kigoma, Ujiji, the main town, with Karema, where I was. This is Congo's on the far side. The training school, the original attempt, was made right where I'm standing here. And it was it's a very spiritual lake. It's most peculiar. I've run out of time to do a reading, but what is happening is the waters are rising, and they don't quite know why. Is it the rift of Africa opening up? Is it, in fact, climate change, climate cycle, warming, runoff because of all the deforestation? That's a drowned mosque, and you get it all the way up and down the lake. I found that particularly moving and stark, as if it was a crisis of my time. But no, because in 1879, one of the diarists explores exactly the same thing. He sees exactly the same thing. This is the way they make their ships on Lake Baikal, and here it's most peculiar, absolutely exactly the same way, because this is a lake that has fierce, fierce storms that come out of nowhere. And this is from one of the 1879 missionaries, and these great tubes that come off the lake in these like sort of swirling storms. And I thought, well, that's a bit of fantasy. And no, not a bit of it. One of the people living on the lake I interviewed said that, yeah, they see those. Because in some of those most violent storms, the fishermen retreat into the bay. And he said, and the ghosts of white people would sometimes appear. You don't know where they've come from, and you do not see them again, he said. There are strange things in Lake Tanganyika. All I can tell you is there are creatures, and you can't avoid them, because God put them there. This is where I stayed with these 2, well, it's 3 actually, fabulous nuns. This convent is built on the exact same site as that first attempt at a training school. Sister Lydia here on the left, I mean, just what a woman. I'm helping her study to be a pharmacist, actually. She's a very special lady, and we made great friends, and she helped me enormously. And then what I should probably just quickly explain is that 2 years later, I went back and I did the whole journey again, because I have a basic principle, which is I never change names in my books. I don't include names of people, living people, unless they give me permission, but I never change their names, because I think that if I'm trying to tell something that is a true story, you have to stand on the record with that truth. And a lot of my sources didn't have mobile phones, certainly didn't have email. So I retraced the entire journey for a second time. And that was when I was accompanied by this brilliant man on the left, Michael Turek, an American photographer who I do a lot of my work with, and these are his images. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And now it's your turn for questions. There'll be mobile microphones going around. And obviously, we hope you'll put your hand up to ask some interesting questions after that fascinating talk. Who is going to be first? Down here in the front row.
Sophie, thank you. Incredible and lyrical, as always. I wondered if you could say something about the local population's historical understanding of elephants. We know, now how sophisticated and intelligent they are. Recently we found out they can repair their own cancer cells. But they're very close to nature, the people that you were with, and did they understand all along? What was their view of the elephants?
No, their view of elephants is ours of deer. They see them as a pest. They destroy crops. They eat them. I was just working in Zimbabwe, where if an elephant, it was in a Victoria National Park, and when the elephants come into the communities and destroy their food, and if they kill someone, the authorities now shoot the elephant. And that elephant is given to the people to eat. It will feed 30 people. So it's a completely different relationship with elephants. Like, it's a really important thing is I'm dealing with perspectives all the time. It's like, whose perspective? How are you looking at this thing? And there are some ethnic groups there's one in the south in an area called Ruaha. And in Ruaha in 1879, it had one particular tribal leader who saw elephants as sacred. That was the only remaining kind of large population of elephants in 1879 because of one particular leader and a set of beliefs. But absolutely no. I mean, they're real problem elephants because of human-wildlife conflict. The population is absolutely exploding human. So what happens to elephants? They need migration routes. They need to be able to move through. It's a really, really difficult situation. And when in southern Africa, that 400 to 500,000 elephant statistic I gave you, across the whole continent, okay? Now, something like, I think it's about 200,000 of those are in what they call the Kaza area, which is bits of Angola, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia. So that nexus has got all the elephants, and it's got far too many. It's a piece I'm doing for The Guardian at the moment called Too Many Elephants. But then up in the north, where they have these huge areas where they could thrive, there are none. So it's really hard. It's to do with human-wildlife populations. There's no romance. Sorry. I should be getting you all by the book with a big romantic story about Robert Redford. Yeah.
Hello, there's a questioner at the back there. And
Sophie, I was going to ask you, it's a question about process, and you said it took 5 years to make this book happen, to write it. And I wondered if on your journeys you're doing the writing at the same time, or if you're writing when you come back, and how you know what you've absorbed when you're away, or do you know it when you're writing when you return?
No, I do loads of audio and I do loads of notepads, but I don't really write when I'm on the road. I'm so busy kind of trying to get story and trying to report it. I mean, there are bits, like some of the better parts of the writing are when I'm done sitting on a tent, kind of feeling it, on Lake Tanganyika or wherever it might be. But it's complex braiding history with the present, and you have to kind of get some distance. And I should say that one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I've made my work in travel, which is profoundly othering. That's its tradition. It's colonial in its bones, look at the other. And during the Black Lives Matter movement, I was getting pilloried on my social media for not posting a black square. And I thought, I'm not going to post a bloody black square. Not because I don't think Black Lives Matter, but because I refuse to turn something so profoundly complex as race and colonialism into a left-right swipe. I'm not going to do it. So I wrote this book, even though my American publisher said, Africa doesn't sell. I said, I write in order to get to the bottom of something that is like that itch. It's, what's that wonderful poem, a poem begins as an itch, that's what it is. And I did it out of that kind of moral itch. And it allowed me, 5 years later, to be able to stand here and be able to talk with a different confidence around race and othering, and to know where I could sit in that in the future and have some confidence about understanding that ideology, this was the line, ideology is like bad breath. You can never smell your own. And that's the perspective shift that I'm doing when I'm on the road. It's like, how can I think elsewhere? Does that make sense?
I think there was another question from over there.
Okay. Sophie, how do you fund it? Because publishers' advances are very, very mean.
Okay, so there's two answers to that. One, I write books that get international rights sold. That's really important. And travel does sell internationally. So my Siberia book went to 11 different markets. This one's already gone to 8 because it's got a global topic. So that helps massively in the publishing industry. The other thing is I'm a bit of a Robin Hood. I take from the rich and I give to the poor. So I am up at 7 o'clock every morning and I work for a Singaporean company. And I do copywriting, advertising, speech writing, and that pays. So it's a kind of half-half. I think most writers will concede that they have another job on the go in order to pay for things like this. Oh.
And behind, I think there was a question.
As I understand it, no elephants were trained, and there were 4 elephants imported for the purpose of training the others. What happened to those 4 elephants?
Well,
or did they decide, well, we'll import yet more, and we'll have an entire imported trained elephants squad?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would hate to answer it because you'd never buy the book. But I will say that training school up in the northeast Congo, that existed right up until the 1980s. You could do elephant-back safaris up there. Nadine Gordimer wrote a brilliant story about riding the elephants there. And that's a really important thing because I rode an elephant when I was 18, my year off in India. I didn't really think too much of it. My dear mother, we went on a trip to Myanmar, Burma, maybe 15 years ago. We rode an elephant and we didn't think too much of it. But by the time I'd finished this book, I'd gone back to Pune in India, where I found the last mahout, who had a lot of the story of the 13, or a lot of the context of the story of the 13 mahouts that went to Africa with those 4. And this is what he said to me when I explained to him about what had happened in Africa. And he said, to ride an elephant gives you a false sense of your own importance. An elephant is very high up. It's a good place to be cowardly from. And it was just like, he just landed why I did the book. And I didn't know that until I sat down and talked with him. So you see, it's like constantly, it's that thing of, you don't know what we're getting wrong now. We have a fair idea. I think Robert Macfarlane made it pretty clear yesterday if we've been listening to his lecture. But we don't know what our crime is as we're living it. Nor did my colonial grandfather know the crime of colonialism then and what it stood for. And I think it's incredibly important to sort of think through past and future in ways that are more porous, perhaps, than the single narratives we are given and are popularized because they're easy. Nuance is what I'm interested in. I'm traveling in the territory of nuance.
There's a question over here.
Hi, so just to go back to your point about how hard it is to report out from Tanzania at the moment, you touched on the use of land for hunting corridors, and you also touched on the clearance of people from ancestral lands. That story is yet to be, really be reported. Is it because people who cover it are facing such threat? Is it because the Dubai royal family are exerting such control in Tanzania? Did you find anything out about that?
Yeah, I mean, lots. Ramtula used to work for a hunting organization, and it's a really mixed, I'm also not black and white about hunting. There are certain areas which are never going to get tourists because they've got really bad tsetse fly or they're far too far away and all the rest of it. And the only way you're going to create any kind of economy for those very far away areas is through the hunting. But the hunting can be done in ways which control what the takeoff is of that particular animal. Lions under age of 5, no. Elephants, they're now culling elephants in Zimbabwe and Zambia, as you know. They're culling them. So they're what do you call it? Yeah, I think it's very complicated. But another answer to that, brilliant article written in The Atlantic recently about the forced evictions of the Maasai in Tanzania out of the crater in the Serengeti, really important piece. Western journalists, big budgets. Tanzanian journalists, disappearing, going to jail. So it's really complicated. But I don't think it's a black and white thing that is no hunting. I think it's area to area. I mean, I personally don't want to have anything to do with it, but I've got to understand it from another perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. You've left us with a lot to think about, and the book is well worth reading, and you will find out what happens to the 4 elephants. And it's a very touching story as well, because of the because of their lives lived through the book. I highly recommend you to buy it. Please let Sophie leave the stage before you move, if you would, but where you're going to buy the book and have it signed is to the left as you leave the building. Thank you all very much indeed for coming, and thank you to Sophie.
Thank you very much.